Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to the ALN Academy webinar on promoting the rule of law in Africa. Today we're going to be focused on the practical approaches to peace, democracy, and security with a very, very dynamic and interesting panel. So the first thing is that I'm going to, talk to you about what ALN Academy is, what it's trying to do, so you can understand where we're going with this whole conversation. And then I'll introduce our wonderful panelists, offering maybe a fun fact about them. And then, of course, my co-moderator over here, I will also introduce him. All right. So the ALN Academy is a charity that's focused on promoting the rule of law in Africa, enhancing good governance on the continent by providing quality legal training as well as capacity building, but also influencing and leading ideas on the rule of law in Africa, just like we're doing right now. Our webinar today is to actually discuss and practical approaches so that we can do some of these objectives. Our rule of law focus areas want us to discuss them, find practical solutions, not just lament about the problems all day, but to actually be solution givers. So our dynamic body of speakers with us today. And the first person we'll discuss is Warren Diaye. So she is an expert in conflict transformation, a coach and mentor on individual and institutional transformational leadership. Warren currently serves as the national representative to the G100 on diplomacy and negotiations, as well as coordinator of the Sunu Capital UMAN. Her work includes a senior global advocacy advisory role at Site Savers in Francophone West and Central Africa. She holds an MA in conflict transformation from EU Center for Justice and Peace Building, and she's based in Senegal. Tendai Biti is a top human rights lawyer in Zimbabwe that has pushed the boundaries of the law and produced numerous groundbreaking human rights judgments on freedom of assembly, judicial bias, and malice, as well as freedom of expression. Interestingly, between 2009 and 2013, he served as the Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe, during which he was named the 2011 Best Finance Minister in Africa by Euromoney Emerging Markets for stabilizing and setting the Zimbabwean economy on a growth trajectory. And then Barbara is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, a certified mediator, an arbitrator, board member of the African Women in Arbitration, and an executive committee member of the Women in ADR Kenya. Barbara is currently serving as the International Development Law Organization country manager in Uganda, seeking to advance rule of law by supporting justice sector reforms in Uganda. Of course, while doing some rule of law work, Alan in Maseru, in Lesotho, will be joining us a little later, and it will be nice to introduce him when everybody can see him. So now my dynamic co-host and co-moderator, Karim Anjarwalla, who is the senior partner to in ALN Kenya, and can go for it with a few words.
Thank you, Tendo. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you are. It's a real pleasure to be here, and also to say to our panelists, in addition to the people online, we also have quite a crowd here actually in the office. I'm not sure whether the video picked that up. The discussion about rule of law is complicated because across Africa now, every leader, Democrat or authoritarian, professes their allegiance to the rule of law, right? And so there seems to be some kind of, it's clearly a nice to have. It's clearly something that leaders feel they need to talk about, which I suppose is progress. But we know that many of our leaders who talk about the rule of law don't mean it in the way that perhaps we have understood it. And so I thought it would be helpful, just before we kick off the discussion, to talk about it, not so much as in the abstract, but to talk about it in terms of what we want the rule of law to achieve, right? And for me, fundamentally, the rule of law is about unleashing human dignity and freedom, right? That's what underpins why we want the rule of law. And human dignity and freedom is important because when humans have dignity and freedom, they're able to provide an environment for inclusive growth. And I think that's important. Inclusive, the focus is on the word inclusive, and shared prosperity, right? Which is what we lack in Africa. We have prosperity, but it's not very shared, right? And that creates its own tensions, right? So for me, the discussion around the rule of law is not abstract, it's very real, okay? And it's about how we unleash human dignity and freedom across our continent. So I just want to set that context for the why I think the rule of law is fundamentally important. And before doing that, after doing that, I wanted to, we're very blessed with the panelists. If I can ask, Tendai is having, as he explained to us earlier, one of the disadvantages of living in a failed state is that internet connectivity isn't great. If I can request Wore, Barbara, and Tendai to switch on their videos. Tendai might only give us a brief glimpse, so he maintains his connectivity. Barbara, Wore, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. If I could just first ask, because each panelist here comes with a very different regional perspective, okay? You'll have figured out that obviously Wore is from West Africa, Senegal. We have Tendai in Zimbabwe, and with obviously the heart of Southern Africa, and Barbara in Uganda. So if I could ask each of you, and I'll start perhaps first with Barbara, and then turn to Wore and Tendai. If you could just give us a quick sense of what you're seeing in your region, and then leave us with a thought about one positive development and one view on what you think is the most major threat to the rule of law in your region. Barbara, starting with you, please.
Thank you very much, Karim, Rutendo. It's an honor to be with you and with the rest of the panelists. I hope you can hear me clearly.
We can.
Good. So, positive development threats on rule of law. Maybe just to start with, of course, the rule of law in several African countries is under threat. And this is simply because we are seeing daily how laws and institutions that are required to implement this are not doing so effectively. And this could either be deliberate, could as a result of different factors that come into play. And for me, one of the key things is financial independence of some of these institutions, like the judiciary, which is the main arm of government, if you will, that can create a culture of justice by enforcing laws, by making through making sure that the decisions showcase that each and every individual who appears before any justice can get out of that particular process comfortable enough with the affirmation that there is equality before the law, which is critical. A positive development that I see, especially in Uganda and in Kenya as well, is the incorporation of community justice institutions. So the use of these institutions that are very people-centered, that deliver justice as and when it is needed, help in ensuring that rule of law is enforced. One threat, of course, that exists is the push by the formal institutions to try and formalize these particular structures, and whereas there is no need to formalize them, maybe a bit of capacity development on issues of the natural justice, principles of natural justice. And the second threat that I would see is limitation in terms of financial capacity for some of the state institutions that are required to promote the rule of law. So, for example, like most judiciaries do complain in Africa that they don't even get at least 2% of the recurrent budgets of the different states within Africa. So this continuously places them at the mercy of other institutions in terms of financial capacity to be able to undertake their mandates. I'll stop there, Karim. I'm sure you'll come back to me later and we can continue the conversation.
Thanks, Barbara. That's extremely helpful. Thank you. Warre, over to you now.
Thank you, Karim. I think I'll go with the threats, and maybe two threats. The first threat to me is a lack of trust altogether that overall citizens have in the rule of law in their respective countries. And I think that when that trust is lacking, it's really conveying a number of consequences, which we usually see. The other one within my region particularly is the recurrence of conflicts, armed conflicts, which gives way to instability within the countries at community level, and doesn't give enough room for the rule of law to be really effective. And of course, when we talk about West Africa, you have all these coups that have happened in a number of countries, such as Mali, Guinea, to name a few. And I think these are really making our countries within the region more unstable and to improving the rule of law at the national level. One positive thing that has happened, I'll talk more about the positive aspect of the transition that we've had recently, with more trust happening when people have hope in a new government, which they feel that they contributed greatly in putting there. When populations have trust and hope in a system, I think it's room to improve.
Thank you. Thank you, Warre. I mean, I think you make a very important point around a very fundamental point around trust and how low trust societies it's difficult to have the rule of law embedded in what is fundamentally a low trust society, because there's very little trust either in how other humans will relate to you, or how, more importantly, the institutions of justice will treat you. Warre, I can't resist but ask a question as a follow-up, because obviously your insights on West Africa are so helpful to us. How do you see, and you've alluded to obviously these issues around the coups. There's obviously been some very major geopolitical shifts in West Africa as well, partly linked to what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. How do you see the next year or two on that front panning out? If you had a crystal ball, what would you say that we can expect in 2025, 2026? Just a very quick response to that before we turn to Tendai. Warre, you're on mute.
Yes. So with the geopolitics, I can say that there are some wars happening, like the framework or the place is being transferred into another setting. And in 2025, I think we need to be careful that these instabilities that we have seen in other countries in Europe be transferred on the African scene. Another thing I think is that we know that we have some countries that have military coups, different systems, different ways of seeing the rule of law, and you have this new regional community that is being created. It's slowly being created, the Sahel, and we need to see how it's going to unfold. What are the institutional frameworks that are going to be developed that can be either enhancing or against the rule of law? These are, I think, the evolutions of the situation in the Sahel region and in West Africa particularly that we need to pay attention to.
Thank you, Warre. Tendai, if I can turn to you now. And just to remind you that you're on mute. Tendai, yeah, there you
You
are.
hear me now? Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, the Southern African region is going through a period of democratic recession and democratic retrenchment. The stronghold of liberation movements in Zimbabwe, ZANU, South Africa, the ANC, Namibia, SWAPO, Mozambique, FRELIMO, Tanzania, Chama cha Mapinduzi, Angola, the MPLA, is having a corrosive effect on democracy. So we've seen massively contested elections in places like Zimbabwe, in places like Angola. We've seen electoral manipulation in Mozambique, even though the election is this weekend, actually. So there is a connection, there's an umbilical cord between the rule of law and democracy. And the two go hand in hand. So the democratic recession has seen a vicious assault on human rights. So we've seen 4 or 5 emerging trends. Number one is, of course, the emasculation of the electoral system. Number two is a crackdown, a massive crackdown on human rights defenders and alternative democratic voices. So you have seen an onslaught in Swaziland. You have seen an onslaught in Zimbabwe. You are seeing an ongoing, unbelievable onslaught in Tanzania as I'm talking to you right now with some of my friends, people like Tundu Lisulu, a lawyer, currently in detention at the present moment at the hands of a very erratic regime. Here in Zimbabwe, we've had people like a lawyer, Job Scala, spending over 2 years in prison. We've over 76 activists. We were arrested on the 16th of June and are still languishing in prison. A third thing is the total, complete emasculation of institutions, starting with the judiciary. In many countries in Southern Africa, the judiciary has just become an extension of the ruling party's, Politburo. And lawyers like myself struggle to go to the Constitutional Court, struggle to go to the Supreme Court, struggle to go to the High Court of Zimbabwe, because you fear prepaid justice, you fear prepaid, outcomes. So the judiciary has been totally emasculated. The law has lost its autonomy. The law has lost its independence. Fourth, and it's not just the judiciary, it's parliament as well. Parliament has been emasculated. Parliament has been flattened. The media in the country that I live, Zimbabwe, 44 years after independence, we still have one broadcaster, the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation. We mainly have one newspaper, the Herald, owned and controlled, of course, by the state. Fourth is the pervasive constitutional, amendments. So in Zimbabwe, despite the fact that we have a relatively new constitution that was enacted in 2013, that constitution has seen 2 major amendments incorporating and affecting, over 80 provisions in a most pervasive, way. One of the things that we thought we had achieved was an independent process of appointing judges that excluded the president. That has been amended. The president now has the sole authority of appointing members of the judiciary. So, and right now, the biggest threat we face as a country, as Zimbabwe, is the president's attempt to amend the constitution to remove the term limit provision and to go for a 3rd term. That will be catastrophic. That will be a disaster, and it may lead to another coup or the potential of a civil war. So that is a threat on its own. A further threat is also just normal legislative amendments. We've currently pending before our parliament a private voluntary organizations bill that is replacing the Social Welfare Organizations Act that will seek to totally emasculate NGOs and place the control of NGOs in the Minister of Justice in the executive. We have amendments that have been made to our Criminal Codification Act, introducing provisions that are known as the Patriot Bill. So if you speak negatively against Zimbabwe, outside Zimbabwe, they will arrest you for treason, and you can be sentenced to capital punishment. So we are seeing a host of legislative amendments, all corroding the rule of law, all corroding constitutionalism as we know it. So we face so many threats as human rights defenders. We face so many threats arising out of the corrosion of the rule of law. You asked me about a positive thing. I think the positive thing that I can mention is the fact that despite these difficulties, there is a strong contingent of human rights defenders, few as they may be, who are still fighting in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Mozambique, in Angola, and so forth. South Africa gives us great hope because they've got a strong judiciary, a strong constitutional court, and we see the same positive, influence of a strong bench in Kenya, for instance. I've been reading and using some of your judgments in some of the cases that I've been doing, for instance, on the basic structure of the Constitution, and also the recent judgments on income tax law, and the judgments that have struck down some provisions of your Finance Act. That is very, very encouraging. So there's a small light at the end of the tunnel. The question is, how long is this tunnel, and is it a breakable tunnel? That is the million-dollar question. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Tendai, for that very insightful, if somewhat depressing and sobering analysis of what's happening. Interestingly, in many cases, under the hands of our liberation movements, which is the great irony in and of itself.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Let me pass on to Rutendo, because I think we want to now talk about, and you'd begun to allude to it, Tendai, some of the practical things we can do. Rutendo, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Tendai, Barbara, and Wari. I'm capturing your question, Tendai. How long is the tunnel? And how long before we can break it, before the light at the end of that tunnel. So I think now that we've had this overview that has let us know about some of the challenges and threats to the rule of law in Africa, particularly the financial capacity of institutions, but also looking at positive developments such as the community justice aspects, but the small slivers of hope that we're finding within regions that people like Tendai, for instance, are using as a way to continue their fight for promoting the rule of law. I think this would be a nice segue into talking about some of the practical approaches to the rule of law. I think the positive developments give us a nice foundation of where we are going on this continent with that. So, I'm going to kick off the question on what are some of the practical approaches to the rule of law that you're witnessing and that you think needs to be instituted, in your region on the continent. So I'll start off with Barbara, based on your history with the justice sector reforms in Uganda, and then Tendai, and perhaps we can finish off with you, Wari, on what the practical approaches are. I think upon conclusion of your discussions, we can perhaps take a few questions to guide the conversation. Co-host.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Fantastic. Barbara?
Sorry, just before Barbara, just before you jump in, just to say there are a number of young lawyers in the room, and I think they would very much want to grasp at this question of practical steps that can be taken. So please bear that in mind. And for those who are online, please put your questions in the chat. They'll be brought up to us and we'll try to incorporate them in the discussion. So please keep your questions flowing in the chat. Thank you. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Rutendo and Karim. I hope I'm still audible.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so practical approaches, what I find to be actually addressing the solution, given the fact that many justice institutions, formal justice institutions in Uganda, are not accessible and are very far from those who really need it, the justice seekers. The use of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and alternative justice systems through the community justice structures have provided solutions to the justice needs that exist. Of course, when Warren mentioned the question of public trust, then the use of these systems assists in the raising of the confidence levels of the different justice seekers, because these are people you understand, you know, you have given them legitimate authority to sit and determine your dispute in a manner that seems to be either compliant to your customs and practices. Now, that has greatly addressed some of the key issues that we have been facing in Uganda. For example, just now, I'm from a place called Nyakanengo, where the nearest court is about 100 kilometers. And of course, you're not going to ask everyone to rush to court to have their matters addressed. So you need the different state institutions. For example, you need to have a police system that understands that not all disputes require imprisonment or detainment. You need people to understand that if it's a land dispute, we ourselves are able to resolve it together in a way that
Barbara, just to say, we're now beginning to lose you.
is more long-lasting and more mutually beneficial. And going forward, what I see many judiciaries trying to evoke the question of, we had a bit of power loss. I don't know if you can still hear me.
Yes,
Hello?
we lost you for about, if you could go back, if you could rewind 30 seconds, that would be great.
Okay. So I was just saying, basically the importance of adopting mechanisms that work for the people and incorporating them with referral systems that recognize and enforce outcomes that come out from this process is one of the ways of institutionalizing ADR, which is alternative dispute resolution processes, and alternative justice systems that are then more consistent with culture, norms, and practices of the people. So I'll stop there. I don't know if there's a follow-on question from that.
No, I think I would just make one comment really on that, which I think is interesting and important. You know, for many of us, we focus very much on large-scale political change, right? A better president, a better judiciary. If only parliament could be more effective. And all of those are really important. But I think the point that Barbara makes is that the rule of law is also a bottom-up approach, right? You've got to get the small things, not the small things, the big things that are important for the ordinary people to work, like ADR around community issues and so on and so forth. That is a critical part of building a rule of law framework in any country. And I think Barbara makes that point very
absolutely.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Barbara. I think one of the things that will be a key takeaway from me is also, you know, some training with the security sector on how, you know, on being able to tell the difference between, you know, disputes that can be handled within a community and disputes that need to go on to the courts. So thank you so much for that. Tendai, could you perhaps talk us through what you think some of the practical approaches to the rule of law are based on your experience?
And Tendai, just before you jump in, I want to ask, particularly because it's you and in Zimbabwe, what can we be doing, we being those not in Zimbabwe, to help places like Zimbabwe? Is there anything that can help us, can help you practically around these issues? Thank you. Could address that as well.
Yes, yeah. So look, the ultimate solution in entrenching, achieving, uh, the actualization of the rule of law in the many dark spots, fragile spaces that I've mentioned, particularly here in Southern Africa. I think issues that you've spoken of, Karim, the issue of a democratic country, the issue of a democratic executive that pays respect to the constitution, and something that you touched on a bit in your introductory remarks, the importance of an inclusive, functional economy. I discovered when I was a Minister of Finance that if you're able to put food on the table and pay decent wages, you are addressing a lot of societal issues, including corruption. So a strong, inclusive economy is one of the conditions sine qua non for the actualization of the rule of law. But that is nivea, that is aspiratory. I think what needs to be done at the immediate moment are the following practical issues or suggestions. Number one, we have been able, and personally in my own space, we've been able to reinforce and use a public interest litigation, strategic litigation, firstly in protecting people, in challenging unconstitutional laws, in protecting vulnerable groups of the society. I've had judgments that have outlawed child marriages, judgments that have increased the age of sexual consent to 18. I've had judgments that have struck down provisions of the Public Order Security Act that prevent people from demonstrating and demonstrating. I've had judgments in socio-economic rights, the right to health, the right to housing, and the right to to a clean environment. So we've been able to extract some positive gains. So public interest litigation is very important, but you know, Karim, that is very difficult. And oftentimes there's a silo approach in Zimbabwe. You do a difficult case, you're on your own, and so forth. So one of the practical things is lawyers working together across the board. When I did my basic structure case, I worked with certain Kenyan lawyers, and the experience was very enriching because of your judgments in the BCI cases. So working together is very, very important in Palu and in other environments. The roles of NGOs cannot be understated. Non-governmental organizations play a key role in assisting, cementing, and pushing the fight for the entrenchment of the rule of law. And Kenya, in particular, has got some very, very strong, local, international, and regional NGOs. And I know that some of them work with the Zimbabwean NGOs, but the message is, can the reach be expanded? Can the relationship be improved qualitatively and quantitatively? A third thing is sharing knowledge. Unlike, for instance, in other jurisdictions like America, where there is some greater modicum of democratization of resources, legal resources, I find that in Africa there's privatization of resources. So sharing databases is very key, and it's something that needs to be explored. So these are some of the practical things that that can be done immediately. But I want to emphasize that it's a marathon. I want to emphasize that the ultimate goal is to make our societies better. How do we make our societies better? The rule of law, constitutionalism, democracy, an inclusive, functional economy. And for many of us, we are still a long way from that.
Thank you so much, Tendai, for that. I really like the sharing knowledge part. I think the role of intelligence and knowledge in this continent is definitely lacking, and making it more democratic, giving it democratic access, would go quite a long way for people to stop working in silos and to actually work together. Warrior yourself, what would you say, are some of the practical approaches to the rule of law that you've noticed in Senegal and in West Africa that perhaps we can draw lessons from?
Thank you so much, Rutendo. I'm going to go ahead and share a couple of good practices throughout the region. In Guinea, for instance, you have Balai Citoyen, which is a network of civil society organizations that kind of monitor the commitment that politicians overall make before elections and the way that they respect their commitments in regards to the rule of law. And really get them to be accountable for their commitments and actions. You also have, as we know earlier, I think we mentioned earlier, the disparity, economic disparity is one of the problems that we notice when it comes to the respect of rule of law. And so you need institutions, you need networks that monitor the way resources are shared at national level or within the region. So you have another network in various countries called Publiez ce que vous payez. Publiez ce que vous payez in most of the French West African countries is publish what you pay. Especially in countries where they have a lot of natural resources, there is this platform where really these networks are monitoring the way government shows that it is accountable and it's credible in the way it is using the resources at national level. Another thing, however, that comes to mind is the decentralization of the rule of law and how communities get to feel that the human dignity is respected. I loved, Karim, when you talked about human dignity earlier. And in some countries like Liberia, you have peace huts, which have been put into place. They have been put into place in communities so that communities themselves address problems that don't necessarily go to the judicial court, and that they have their own indigenous way, if I can use that way, at local level to address these issues. And I think this is really important. Why? Because we know that the majority of the conflicts that are happening around the world are in Africa. And 90% of the conflicts that have been happening in Africa are around elections, before elections, during elections, after elections. Before elections, you need populations to have mechanisms at national level to address whatever issues that they have, because more and more community instabilities are reflecting at national level and on borders. So definitely we need to invest and promote mechanisms that are at community level for communities themselves to address their own issues, because most of the time, because of that trust that I talked about earlier, because of patriarchal societies, populations don't necessarily find themselves in the justice system that has been developed at national level. Another example, I think Karim also mentioned it, it's restorative justice. I think the peace hut is a form of restorative justice, but I think we need to develop more of the restorative justice concept at national level to address all these issues. And in Sierra Leone, you have the Fumble Talk, where populations sit around a fire and really resolve the problems that they have locally. Now, the last thing that I would love to talk about is coming back really to elections. We know, as I said earlier, that elections really are a source of conflict, and also address the fact that the rule of law is not really respected. unlike Zimbabwe or some countries in the eastern part of Africa, in West Africa, in the past 10 years, since 2008, you have the elections monitoring mechanism, which really works. People believe in it and trust it. When elections happen, you have a number of people who are deployed throughout the country. And civil society does have a platform which is very, very reliable, that collects the number of votes and so on, and really follows the elections during the day of the elections. And the platforms that are used have been enhanced and are really trusted. They have been used recently in Mauritania. They have been used a number of times in Liberia, including last year in October, and in Senegal. Once again, when I do these kinds of presentations, I'd like to touch on other countries and not necessarily Senegal, but Senegal is a perfect example. We just came from elections last March, and the elections monitoring mechanism is trusted and it works very well. There's a platform called Suñu Élection. Suñu means our election. And once population call it ours, it means that they feel that they are included, and it's a participatory approach. These are the various points that I wanted to bring in. And I think coming back to the community level, it's important to tap into community approaches which do exist more and more, inclusive participatory local development approaches, where you have all citizens, all stakeholders at community level being involved to address these issues, which in the end affect the respect of the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have some questions in the chat that I think maybe we can perhaps quickly address while we segue into the next section. So I'm just going to collapse them because there's two, one from Rupert and one from Anonymous. And you know, the anonymous question really asks us, you know, whether there is an impetus amongst our leaders to entrench the rule of law in Africa, and how to actually, you know, start to influence that impetus if it's not there at all. And the second question is asking us on what is likely to lead to the entrenchment of the rule of law in Africa, which I believe that, you know, at some point in this webinar we're actually going to address, but no pressure to our speakers to bring it up as we go. So I think in our conversations in the next section, we can perhaps be trying to address those questions as well. Karim?
Thank you. Also to say to those in the room, I'm looking to the team here, if we send a mic out, their questions can be heard, right? So if anyone has questions, put your hand up, and we'll make sure that we bring a mic to you. We don't want you to feel excluded, and that only those online have the ability to ask questions. So I think there's a question at the back here. Let's take that as in the interest of balanced justice. Yeah.
So hi everyone. My question around the practical approaches, what I'm very interested and keen to hear on is how to promote an active citizenry amongst most of our nations. Because see, in the past couple of months here in Kenya, we've seen a real shift between in our citizens and how they engage politically. And in the past, and quite disappointingly so, you would see a lot of Kenyans being very passive towards issues that are affecting the country. In fact, sometimes enabling of the erosion of the rule of law generally. But in the past 3 months, we've seen situations where people really come up, mobilize, skill share in all different levels of approaches in trying to stem the tide that is the affront on the rule of law and democracy in the country. And I just wanted to know whether there are similar experiences amongst the panelists in their different approaches in their different countries and specific situations, and how we can engender this further or keep the flame burning here in Kenya and in other countries in Africa.
So may I suggest this? We only have about 15 minutes to go, and I want to get the most out of our incredible panel. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to put Raphael's question, and I'm going to ask Warre to deal with Raphael's question. And for those in the chat, I'm going to ask Barbara and Tendai to have a go at those in the chat, but just for a minute each. So if I can paraphrase Warre, Raphael's question in a way, you know that we had this big uprising in Kenya that was called the Gen Z protests. And I think we have many Gen Z in the room, and the sense is that that flame has burnt out, right? And so in a way, I think Raphael's question is, how can we keep the flame burning, okay? And what can we learn from elsewhere and about how to keep a movement on the road, how to keep the flame burning and how to not get Raphael, have I posed your question summarily correctly? How to not get put out by very powerful forces. Warre, can I ask you to take that one?
Yes, sure. I would like to comment, first of all. Can you hear me?
Now. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Now, I wanted to start by commending Kenya for the resilience of the people of Kenya and the work that people have been doing right now to really get the government to account for its actions. And I think there are two things. First of all, unfortunately, when these movements start, they don't start out of a strategy. They start out of the fire of the moment. And I think where you guys are now, you need to have a long-term strategy. If government doesn't doesn't react or the way that you guys are expecting it within the next 6 months or the next year, what are you guys going to do? There must be a strategy, a movement strategy in the long run that needs to be developed with really actions that need to be taken. Best case scenarios, worst case scenario, and at national level, you guys work on it. Another thing is that I think there isn't enough solidarity from the countries that are around Kenya. And we have seen in West Africa some events that have happened, for instance, in the Gambia, in Mali, in Niger, where we have a network of, in here, I'm talking about the women's network, really, where you have some men also, but it's civil society, think tanks, international organizations that come together and do a mission in that country in solidarity with that country. I can give you a number of examples, pictures, and even speeches and articles that have been written about those solidarity missions. I think, what can you guys do to get that solidarity from countries that are around, not only around, but further on the continent? And I think we need to use more of the social media to create that synergy of action between all these countries to enhance the movement and get it going. But the worst thing that can happen is people getting tired or giving up. You cannot give up after the struggle that you have showed in the past couple of months. So you need to get the movement going. And this is, as I said earlier, through a strategy that you will be developing and implementing. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raphael, hoping that answers your question. But I think, as we are moving to the next section, some questions that the panelists can already have in mind for their upcoming responses have to do, for instance, where the restorative justice mechanisms in Africa are concerned, is to also address at what point these mechanisms can begin to be regarded as official system versus systems on the fringe, and also a discussion on the technology and suggestions for rights holders and defenders to create safe and cyber platforms in which they can create that solidarity. We have an agreement here with Barbara's submissions that ADR ensures community involvement, and the ADRs cannot be considered as alternative and strengthened to be the institutions of justice. Therefore, the question is, should the law be informed by culture, and why is this not the case? So I think, Karim, perhaps if you can lead us into the next section and towards wrapping up.
Thank you. So I want us to talk about two things in the minutes we have left. One is technology, and the second is the role of the global north, if I can put it that way, whether positive or negative or neutral in the years ahead. Okay, so turning first to technology, perhaps we can talk a little bit about some innovative approaches to monitoring and reporting on rule of law violations, and how you see, Tendai, we've talked about how elections in some countries have become performative democracy, right? Nothing more than a theatrical performance rather than something substantive, and how technology can play a part in dealing with that. We've already heard, for example, from Wore on the EMM, right? Mechanism in West Africa. So Tendai, can I start with you and then turn quickly on the question of technology to Barbara and to Wore?
Yeah, very quickly. Firstly, on the influence of the global north, I think that we are living in a very fluid and dangerous world. I think you alluded to it. The war in the Ukraine, the war in Gaza, now Iran is shelling Israel. China is eyeing Taiwan. China is having scuffles in the South Sea, China with South China Sea with the Philippines. There are rumblings in Latin America, in places like Colombia and so forth. So we may be on the foothills of a third world war. It's a very unstable environment. The rise of non-state actors committing violence, as we saw in 9/11, and non-state actors holding real power, makes this a very unstable environment. With respect, the post-Second World War consensus, which stopped and prevented a war for 70 years, I think is collapsed. So I think we are now in a new turbulent era of history. I mean, look on the African continent, the Sahel, Sudan. There are more people we have died in Sudan than in both Gaza and Sri Lanka combined. Somalia, Somaliland, Ethiopia. It's a dog's breakfast. So I think that we are living in a very dangerous world, and of course a turbulent world. Human rights, sacrifice the common people, sacrifices the Wananchi. But more importantly, the issue of technology. I think that wherever technology has been implemented fully, it has mitigated electoral fraud and electoral scam. If you look at Nigeria, they've made progress through the use of biometric voting, biometric use of biometric technologies. I observed the Kenyan election 2 years ago, and I was very impressed with the use of those paths that we're using, that made reconciliation and accountability much easier than the manual prehistoric methods that we are still seeing here. The use of servers and access to servers creates a platform for greater transparency and greater accountability, which is why banana republics such as Zimbabwe governments refuse to migrate to those technologies. So in short, technology is the future. The digital world is the future. Artificial intelligence is the future. Blockchain chain technology is the future. And no wonder why autocratic regimes are slow to embrace these technologies.
Thank you, Tendai. I'll at the end have a word or two on the full embracing of technology and how a half embracing can almost be worse than no technology. So with that, can I now turn to Barbara, then Warren?
Thanks,
Barbara?
Karim. Yeah, for me, the question on technology and I think the second question was on the what was on the Q&A, restorative justice.
Yeah, and the role of the
Karim?
global north. Yeah.
Role of the global north.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll begin. I'll switch it. What is the role of the global south, Karim, if you allow me?
Thank
And
you.
that begins with us. So I believe that continuing active engagement with all the citizenry to understand the laws, to understand their rights, and to be able to agitate for them, and to be able to actually hold institutions accountable is where we must all start. What the global north then decides to do is up to them. But before they come on board, I believe it is our collective responsibility as the citizens of Africa to make sure that we are walking this journey together, that we do not have these conversations only in cafes or in offices, but we are involving every individual, including the Mwananchi that is at the corner of Kapedo, that is at the corner of Taita or Mombasa, wherever it is that they may be, so that they are aware of their rights and their responsibilities and the duties of the state, so that they are able to hold them accountable. Because in that, will we be able to actually effect change? Because then all the leaders will be able to understand that they can no longer take the citizenry for granted, because everyone knows their rights, everyone understands them, and knows what channels to use to be able to bring these particular institutions to check. On technology, the support, for example, the work that I have done, especially in the commercial justice sector reforms within the judiciary of Kenya, which then led to the adoption of the e-filing system, are all good, well meaning, well deserved. They reduce opaqueness in the different justice systems. They reduce opportunities for corruption, because when you have systems that are functional, then it becomes very difficult to tell people to give you the brown envelope to facilitate a particular action, because then it is clear what is supposed to be done, how it is done, how much time it will take for it to be achieved. But it is important to have this discussion in recognition of the fact that the digital divide is still very big in Africa. And we need to find solutions of how we can improve it so that we all benefit from technology. So, for example, where I am right now, I'm sure I'm still breaking in and out. And that's because I have to stop somewhere and tether for the purposes of this meeting. But network coverage in this particular area is still quite poor. And to be able to bring everyone to the same table, we need to be able to ensure that the resources and the infrastructure are also delivered to the people in the communities. So I would suggest that in any discussion where technology is being promoted, the need to address the digital divide begins as a core priority to be addressed. After that, then we can move forward to how do we continue the different innovative measures that are being developed using AI and the different blockchain processes that will improve in the administration of justice. Back to you, Karim.
Thank you so much. So we're going to give Barbara, we're going to give Warre rather the closing word, and then we'll wrap up. Warre, over to you.
All right. Karim, when you talked about the global south, the global north, I thought right away of the SDGs. And we thinking about SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So what is the responsibility of the global north, including our international organizations such as the UN, when it comes to the commitments that our countries have made in there, and those countries do report on the SDGs, including this SDG. How is the system, the framework, through the indicators that have been developed, making these countries commit to these international instruments? And as we talk about Africa, I'm not talking about West Africa here. I'm thinking again, because I love to think about frameworks, institutional instruments that exist. The agenda of the Africa we want, Agenda 2063. One of its goals is an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and rule of law. Again, our countries do report to the AU every year on these goals. So what is the responsibility of these institutions that have been put into place to get our respective countries to account for these commitments? Now, talking about technology, I think there are great innovative approaches that exist. There are some mobile apps and online platforms that do exist that allow citizens to anonymously report human rights violations. And there are whistleblower blowers who are there. Now I think we need to look at the mechanisms that are put into place to protect those whistleblowers. For example, there's the French law of 21 March 2022, which offers increased protection to whistleblowers. Now, how is it adapted to our context? But overall, I think if we have to talk about good practices, there are some good practices of using technology in the various countries to monitor the respect of the rule of law. And thank you for inviting us in this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wore, Barbara, Tendai. I can't tell you how grateful we and the audience are for taking the time. I know you're all incredibly busy. You're all doing exceptional work, and I can see that some of you are even, I think, literally on the road doing your work, and you've taken the time to join us. So on behalf of the ALN Academy, our director here, Aisha Abdallah, is actually here in the audience, Rutendo, and myself, our great thanks. The ALN Academy is focused on promoting the rule of law and governance across Africa. We really solicit your encouragement, your support, your participation, and pushing the agenda that we all, I think, commonly believe in and see as vitally important to this basic concept of human dignity and freedom that we see violated daily in our country, across the continent, and across the world. And I think Tendai's comment around the change of the world order is not to be underestimated. I grew up in the decades when we thought peace, prosperity, and democracy was to bloom. I'm afraid to say that those in the room I'm looking at, particularly because they are younger, your time is a different time with a different challenge. The world is no longer policed in the way that it was, and the norms around which we grew up, that I grew up, seem to be shifting daily. So your challenges are in many ways, I think, much bigger in your youth than mine were in mine. So with those few remarks, anything else from my wonderful co-host, Rutendo?
No, I think just to capture, some of the discussions that we've had, I think some key takeaways for us going forward is to really take seriously the role of community-based approaches, particularly the ones that are already existing and functioning. I think your role is to really see where you can contribute and how you can strengthen those mechanisms, particularly where national institutions are failing us. I think another key takeaway is, to continue to advocate for greater access to information, particularly access to the information that allows us to promote the rule of law, and through promoted in an informed way, going forward. And I think, as Warrior mentioned as well, to build long-term strategies around the advocacy work that is being done in different countries. Without those strategies, movements fall apart, the government of the day continues the way that it does, and then we don't go forward. But, we want to continue this discussion with you all online, offline. So please don't forget to comment, like, share, subscribe, everything that you need to do so that we can continue the conversation forward. And to just let all of you know that we do have another webinar that's coming up on the 30th of October, and that will be discussing the role of ESG and the African Continental Free Trade Area, moderated by our own director, Anjarwalla. So we're really, really hoping for your participation on that one. But with that, thank you so much, Tendai, Barbara, and Warrior, for making it. Thanks for taking all of my many, many, many calls. And thank you so much to my co-host, Karim. I think he deserves a round of applause. But yes, so I think this will be our conclusion. We have some tea and biscuits for those offline, those online.
We are sending
good luck.
we are sending digital biscuits and digital tea.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Awesome.
Or a
Bye,
bottle of
everyone.
whiskey.
Thank you so much.
A bottle of whiskey. Thank
And
you.
a bottle of whiskey for you, Tendai.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Tendai. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Don't worry. Bye, Barbara.